Jake Morrison gripped the controls of his small ship as everything around him started to shake. Red lights flashed across every screen in front of him. The plasma storm had come out of nowhere, hitting his vessel with the force of a hammer. He was a lieutenant in humanity's exploration fleet, and he had been mapping this solar system for the past 2 months. Nothing in his scans had warned him about this storm. The ship dropped fast through the atmosphere of the fourth planet. Jake pulled hard on the controls, trying to keep the nose up, but half his systems were already dead. The navigation computer went dark. Then the main thrusters cut out. Through the front window, he could see trees rushing up to meet him. They were strange trees with purple leaves and twisted trunks, nothing like Earth. The impact threw Jake against his restraints hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Metal screamed as the ship tore through branches and slammed into the ground. The vessel skidded sideways, plowing through mud and plants before finally coming to rest at an angle. For a long moment, Jake just sat there, breathing hard, checking himself for injuries. His ribs hurt, but nothing felt broken. He ran a quick check of his suit systems. The environmental controls were working. His oxygen recycler showed green. The communication array was completely fried, showing nothing but static. Jake cursed under his breath. No one would hear his distress signal through this storm. He was alone on an alien world with no way to call for help. Rain hammered against the broken hull of his ship. Through the cracked viewport, Jake could see lightning splitting the dark sky. The storm was getting worse, not better. He needed to find shelter, and fast. His ship was done, the hull breached in at least 3 places that he could see. Staying here meant freezing to death once night fell. Jake grabbed his emergency pack from the storage locker. Inside was a thermal blanket, a portable heater, water purification tablets, and a week's worth of ration bars. His plasma pistol was clipped to his belt, standard issue for all exploration personnel. He sealed his helmet and checked the external temperature. It was dropping fast. He climbed out through the broken side hatch and immediately sank ankle-deep into purple mud. The rain was so heavy he could barely see 10 meters in any direction. Jake picked a direction away from the worst of the wind and started walking. Every step was a fight against the mud that tried to hold his boots. That was when he heard it. A sound that cut through the storm, high and desperate. It sounded almost like crying. Jake stopped and listened. There it was again, coming from somewhere to his right. His training told him to ignore it, to focus on his own survival. But something in that sound made him turn toward it. He pushed through thick bushes with leaves that felt like rubber against his gloves. The crying got louder. Jake pulled aside a curtain of vines and stopped dead. There, in a small hollow beneath an overturned tree root, were 3 small creatures huddled together. They were about the size of large cats, covered in fur that shimmered silver and gray in his helmet lights. Their eyes were huge and round, reflecting his lights like mirrors. They had small, pointed ears pressed flat against their heads and tiny paws with what looked like retractable claws. When they saw Jake, they pressed closer together and made frightened sounds. Jake knew immediately these were not prey animals. The claws, the teeth he could see when they opened their mouths, the way their eyes tracked his movements. These were predators. Baby predators, but predators all the same. And they were freezing in the storm, probably separated from their parent. Every regulation in the First Contact Manual said not to interfere with native species. Jake had spent 3 years in deep space exploration, and he knew the rules by heart. But as he stood there watching these 3 small creatures shake with cold and fear, the rules seemed very far away. Thunder boomed overhead, so loud it felt like the sky was breaking apart. The cubs cried out in terror and tried to dig deeper into their hollow. But there was no shelter there, just mud and water pooling around them. They would not survive the night in this storm. Jake made his decision. He pulled the thermal blanket from his pack and moved slowly toward the cubs. They hissed at him, showing those small, sharp teeth. but they were too cold and weak to run. Jake wrapped the blanket around all three of them and carefully lifted the bundle. They squirmed inside but did not try to bite him. Maybe they understood he was trying to help, or maybe they were just too tired to fight. Now Jake had a bigger problem than just his own survival. He was lost on an alien world in a storm with 3 baby predators. Somewhere out there was probably a very large, very angry parent looking for these cubs, and Jake was carrying them away. The weight in his arms was warm against his suit. He could feel the cubs moving inside the blanket, pressing against each other. Jake turned his face into the wind and started walking again. He needed to find real shelter now, not just for himself, but for these 3 small lives he had decided to save. The forest around him was dark and hostile. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound made him jump. But Jake kept walking, one foot in front of the other, carrying his small passengers through the storm. He was a soldier trained for combat and exploration. But tonight he was something else. Tonight, he was a rescuer. Lightning flashed again, showing him a rocky hillside ahead. Jake squinted through the rain and saw what looked like a dark opening in the rocks. A cave, maybe. It was not much, but it was better than nothing. He picked up his pace, ignoring the burning in his legs and the cold seeping through his suit. The cave entrance was half hidden by thick vines. Jake pushed through them and stumbled into darkness. His helmet lights clicked on automatically, showing him a space large enough to stand in and deep enough to be dry. The sound of the storm became muffled behind him. Jake set the bundle of cubs down gently near the back wall. He pulled out his portable heater and activated it. The small device started humming, pushing out blessed warmth. The cubs immediately scrambled toward it, the blanket falling away. They huddled around the heater and slowly stopped shaking. Jake allowed himself to sink down against the cave wall. His muscles ached and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. He watched the 3 cubs as they began to relax in the warmth. They were actually quite beautiful in their own way, with their silver fur and bright eyes. One of the cubs, the smallest of the 3, looked up at Jake. It made a small chirping sound, almost curious. Jake smiled behind his helmet. He had no idea what he was going to do next. He was stranded with no communication and 3 alien animals that might have a very protective parent hunting for them, but for now, they were safe and warm, and somehow, that felt like enough. The storm continued to rage outside while Jake sat in the cave watching the 3 cubs. They had stopped shaking and were now exploring their temporary shelter. Their movements were graceful and careful, each step placed with precision. These were hunters, even at this young age. Jake could see it in the way they tested the ground before putting weight on their paws. His suit computer showed that 2 hours had passed since the crash. The emergency heater would last maybe 4 more hours before the power cell died. After that, the cold would become a problem again. Jake's suit could keep him warm for a while, but the cubs would freeze without the heater. He needed to think about his situation clearly. His ship was destroyed. The communication system was dead. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Even if it cleared, he had no way to send a signal to his fleet. They would start searching for him eventually, but this planet was huge. Finding one person in all this wilderness would take weeks. The smallest cub approached Jake again. It sat down in front of him and tilted its head, studying him with those large, reflective eyes. Jake slowly removed one glove and extended his bare hand. The cub sniffed his fingers carefully, then made a soft sound and rubbed its head against his palm. The fur was incredibly soft, like silk. Jake felt something shift in his chest. This was not just an animal. There was intelligence in those eyes, awareness that went beyond simple instinct. He had seen enough creatures on enough worlds to recognize the difference. This cub was thinking, learning, deciding to trust him. The other 2 cubs had found something interesting. They were pawing at the cave wall, making excited chirping sounds. Jake stood up and walked over to see what had caught their attention. His helmet lights swept across the wall, and he froze. There were carvings in the stone, not random scratches or natural formations, but deliberate marks cut deep into the rock. Jake moved closer, his trained eye examining the patterns. They were symbols of some kind, arranged in rows and columns. Some looked like they might be writing. Others looked more like pictures or maps. This changed everything. Carvings meant tool use. Tool use meant intelligence. These symbols were old, worn smooth in places by time, but still clear enough to see. Someone had made this cave into something more than just a shelter. This was a place of meaning. Jake pulled out his damaged recorder and tried to activate it. The screen flickered but came on. He began documenting everything he could see, taking images of the symbols from multiple angles. If he ever made it back to his ship, this data would be crucial. Humanity had found evidence of intelligent life on this world. The cubs had lost interest in the wall and were now playing with each other, tumbling and pouncing in the way young predators everywhere seemed to enjoy. Jake smiled, watching them. They seemed happy now, safe and warm and fed. Well, not fed exactly. Jake frowned. What did these creatures eat? He had no idea, and his emergency rations were definitely not meant for alien predators. He turned his attention back to the carvings. Some of the symbols repeated in patterns. Jake traced his fingers over them, trying to find meaning. One section looked like it might be a map, with lines radiating from a central point. Other sections showed what might be buildings or structures. There were also images of creatures that looked remarkably like the cubs, but larger, much larger. A thought occurred to Jake. If there were intelligent beings on this planet who carved symbols in caves, where were they now? His exploration team had scanned this world from orbit for 2 weeks before he came down. They had found no cities, no roads, no electromagnetic signatures that would indicate advanced technology, just wilderness and weather. So either the beings who made these carvings were long gone, or they were very good at hiding. Jake was betting on the second option. The carvings did not look ancient enough to be from a dead civilization. They were old, but not prehistoric. A deep sound echoed from outside the cave. It was not thunder. It was something else, something that made the cubs freeze instantly. All 3 of them flattened their ears and pressed close to the cave floor. The smallest one let out a tiny whimper. Jake's hand went to his plasma pistol. That sound had been organic, alive, and big. Very big based on the depth and resonance. He moved to stand between the cubs and the cave entrance, knowing his small weapon would probably not do much against whatever had made that sound. The roar came again, closer this time. Jake could hear something moving through the forest outside, breaking branches and pushing through undergrowth. Something massive. The cubs were shaking again, but not from cold this time. They knew what was out there. Jake activated his external speakers. It was a risk, but maybe, just maybe, if there was intelligence out there, communication might work better than violence. He kept his voice calm and steady. "I mean no harm," Jake said clearly. "I found the young ones in the storm. They were in danger. I only wanted to help them." The movement outside stopped. There was silence, except for the rain and distant thunder. Then slowly, very slowly, a shape appeared at the cave entrance. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The creature was enormous. It stood at least 3 meters tall at the shoulder, with the same silver-gray fur as the cubs, but marked with darker stripes along its sides. Its build was powerful, mixing the mass of a bear with the sleek grace of a big cat. But what struck Jake most were the eyes. They glowed in his helmet lights with the same intelligence he had seen in the cubs, but deeper, older, more aware. This was not an animal. This was a person. A different kind of person than human, but a person nonetheless. The creature lowered its massive head and made a rumbling sound deep in its chest. The cubs immediately responded, scrambling toward their parent and making excited noises. Jake slowly raised his hands, showing he held no weapon, and stepped aside to let the young ones pass. The cubs reached their parent and climbed over each other, trying to get close. The large creature bent down and carefully checked each one, sniffing them and making gentle sounds. Satisfied they were unharmed, it turned its attention back to Jake. For a long moment, human and alien stared at each other. Jake could see the creature thinking, weighing options, making decisions. It was judging him based on his actions. He had protected its young, kept them warm and safe. That had to count for something. The creature made a decision. It dipped its head in what could only be described as a nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. Then it turned toward the carved wall that had interested the cubs earlier. With one huge paw, the creature reached out and pressed against a specific symbol in the center of the pattern. There was a grinding sound of stone on stone. A section of the cave wall swung inward like a door, revealing a passage that led down into darkness. Hidden stairs carved into the living rock. The creature looked back at Jake. Its eyes seemed to carry a message, though Jake could not be sure what it meant. Then it herded its 3 cubs toward the opening, and they disappeared into the passage below. But the door remained open. The creature had left it open. Jake stood at the entrance to the passage, his mind racing. This was an invitation, or maybe a test. The creature had shown him a secret, a way into something hidden. The question was whether Jake should follow or stay in the cave and wait for rescue that might never come. His suit readings showed his power cells were draining faster than expected. The cold was getting worse and his thermal systems were working overtime. He had maybe 8 hours of full function left, less if he had to keep moving through the cold. From deep in the passage below, Jake heard the cubs calling, not in distress but in something else. An invitation, maybe. A welcome. Jake made his choice. He activated his recorder to continuous mode, checked his plasma pistol one more time, and stepped into the passage. The stairs were wide and smooth, worn by countless passages over unknown years. The walls glowed faintly with some kind of natural light, enough to see by without using his helmet lamps. As Jake descended deeper into the planet, he realized he was not just exploring a cave. He was entering something much larger. Each step took him further from the surface and closer to answers he had not even known to look for. The creature had trusted him with its young. Now it was trusting him with something more, a secret that might change everything humanity thought they knew about this world. The passage opened into a space so vast that Jake stopped walking and just stared. His helmet lights barely reached the far walls. The cavern stretched out before him like an underground canyon, but this was no natural formation. This was built, carved, designed with purpose and skill. Buildings rose from the cavern floor, structures carved directly from the living rock. They had doorways and windows, bridges connecting them at different levels, walkways spanning the open spaces between. Everything glowed with soft blue-green light from some kind of plant or fungus that covered the walls and grew in careful patterns. The light was beautiful and strange, making the entire underground city look like something from a dream. And there were people. Dozens of the large creatures moved through the space. Some carried tools or containers. Others watched over groups of younger ones playing in open areas. Jake saw creatures of different sizes, from cubs barely bigger than the 3 he had rescued to adults even larger than the one that had led him here. This was a society, organized and complex. Jake realized he was standing at the entrance with every eye in the cavern now fixed on him. The creatures had noticed the stranger in their home. Several of them had stopped what they were doing and were watching him carefully. He could feel the weight of their attention, dozens of those glowing eyes studying him. The parent of the cubs emerged from a nearby building and made a deep rumbling call. Several other creatures approached, including one that was clearly older than the rest. This elder had distinctive markings along its spine and moved with the careful dignity of age. It studied Jake for a long moment, then made a series of sounds that were obviously language. The parent creature responded, gesturing with its paw first toward Jake, then toward its cubs who were playing nearby with other young ones. The elder listened, then approached Jake slowly. Jake held his ground even though every muscle wanted to run. Running would be pointless anyway. These creatures could probably catch him in 3 steps. The elder lowered its head until its eyes were level with Jake's helmet. This close, Jake could see the depth of intelligence there. This being had lived a long time, seen many things, and was now examining Jake with the same scientific interest he felt toward them. The elder was trying to understand what Jake was, why he was here, and what threat or opportunity he represented. After what felt like forever, the elder straightened and made a sound that might have been satisfaction. It turned and began walking deeper into the cavern, pausing to look back at Jake. The meaning was clear. "Follow me." Jake followed, very aware of all the creatures watching from doorways and bridges. Some looked curious, some looked worried, but none seemed hostile. Children, or cubs rather, peeked out from behind their parents to get a look at the strange visitor. Jake tried to appear as non-threatening as possible, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. The elder led him through the underground city. Jake saw evidence of sophisticated tool use everywhere. There were carvings on walls, some decorative and some that looked like writing. He saw what might be water collection systems, channels carved to guide underground streams to where they were needed. There were spaces that looked like gardens growing strange plants under the glow of the luminescent fungus. They arrived at a building larger than the others, more elaborate in its design. The elder entered, and Jake followed into what appeared to be a place of knowledge. The walls were covered in carvings, but these were different from the symbols in the cave above. These told stories. Jake's training in studying alien cultures helped him understand. The images showed these creatures living on the surface in great numbers. They had built cities under the open sky, structures that reached toward the stars. Then something changed. The carvings showed ships descending from above, beings that looked somewhat like humans but clearly were not. There was conflict depicted in harsh, violent images, destruction, fire falling from the sky. The final images showed the creatures fleeing underground, their surface cities destroyed. Jake felt his stomach drop as he understood. These people were refugees. They had been driven from the surface of their own world by invaders from space. The elder watched as Jake studied the wall carvings. It moved to a particular section and placed its paw on one image. The carving showed ships, and they looked disturbingly familiar in their basic design. Not human ships exactly, but following similar principles. The beings operating them were shown in armor, carrying weapons. Jake's chest tightened. These people had been attacked by spacefaring invaders, and now here he was, another being from space who had crashed on their world. The elder's eyes held a question. Was Jake like those others? Was humanity another threat? Jake slowly reached up and removed his helmet. It went against every safety protocol, but he needed to make a gesture of trust. The air was breathable. Slightly richer in oxygen than Earth standard, but not dangerously so. He looked directly into the elder's eyes. "We are not like them," Jake said, knowing the words meant nothing but hoping his tone would carry meaning. "Humans do not come to destroy. We come to learn, to understand, to make friends." The elder regarded him silently. Then, moving with great care, it reached out with one massive paw and gently touched Jake's shoulder. The gesture was unmistakable across any cultural divide. A connection had been made. The elder led Jake to another section of the repository. These carvings were newer, less worn by time. They showed not history, but something else. A warning. The images depicted the invader ships gathering, many of them, preparing for something. The carvings showed astronomical positions, planetary alignments, calculations that Jake did not fully understand. But he understood enough. The invaders were coming back. Jake studied the astronomical markers more carefully. His training in navigation helped him make sense of the positions shown. If he was reading this right, and he was increasingly sure he was, the invaders were gathering at a staging point maybe 3 weeks away at standard faster-than-light speeds. His blood went cold. The Elder was showing him this for a reason. These people had been watching the skies, tracking movements, preparing as best they could. But they knew what was coming, and they knew they could not fight it alone. Not against ships with orbital weapons and armies. Jake looked at the Elder and saw his own understanding reflected in those ancient eyes. This was why the parent creature had brought him here. This was why the Elder had shown him these things, not as a threat or a demand, but as a plea for help. They needed allies, and fate had dropped a human soldier onto their world at exactly the right moment. The question was what Jake could do about it. He was one person, stranded, with no communication and limited supplies. How could he help an entire civilization? The answer came to him slowly. His crash site. The ship was destroyed, but the emergency beacon was built to survive impacts that would tear the rest of the ship apart. If he could get back there, if he could power up the beacon, he could send a signal. His fleet would come looking for him. And if they came, if he could show them what he had found here, if he could convince them of the threat, maybe, just maybe, humanity would help. It was a long shot. It violated first contact protocols. It might start an interstellar incident. But looking at the Elder, thinking about the cubs playing outside, imagining this entire underground civilization wiped out by orbital bombardment, Jake knew he had to try. He turned to the Elder and began drawing in the dust on the floor. A rough star chart with this planet at the center. He pointed up toward space, then to himself, then made a gesture of ships coming. The Elder watched intently, and Jake saw the moment understanding clicked. Over the next hours, Jake learned more about the underground city. The Elder showed him maps of the tunnel systems connecting multiple settlements across the planet. There were hundreds of thousands of these people living in hiding, preserving their culture, waiting and hoping. The parent creature stayed with Jake, almost serving as a guide, and slowly Jake began to recognize different sounds they made as words. The creatures brought him food, strange fruits, and prepared dishes that his suit's scanner said were safe. They brought him water from their underground springs, clean and cold. They showed him their lives, their children, their hopes, and Jake documented everything, knowing that this evidence might be what convinced his commanders to act. When Jake finally indicated he needed to return to his crash site, the parent creature made a series of calls. 2 other large creatures approached, warriors by the look of them, strong and alert. They would guide him back through the tunnels, the parent creature indicated. They would help him reach his ship. Jake nodded his gratitude. As he prepared to leave, the smallest cub ran up to him and made a chirping sound, rubbing against his leg. Jake crouched down and gently stroked its soft fur. He had saved them from a storm, and in return, they had shown him a world worth saving. The journey through the tunnels was faster than Jake's desperate run through the storm had been. The 2 warrior creatures moved with purpose through the underground passages, their knowledge of the routes making navigation simple. Jake followed, his suit lights adding to the natural glow from the fungus that grew along the walls. The tunnels were not crude holes dug through dirt. They were engineered, carved with the same precision as the buildings in the underground city. Some sections had channels for water drainage. Others had ventilation shafts that allowed fresh air to circulate. This network had been built over many years, maybe centuries, by a people who knew they might never return to the surface. Jake's mind kept returning to the warning carved in the repository. 3 weeks. That was all the time they might have before the invaders returned. 3 weeks to repair a beacon, send a signal, convince his fleet to help, and prepare some kind of defense. It seemed impossible, but the alternative was doing nothing, and Jake had never been good at doing nothing. They emerged onto the surface as dawn broke over the alien landscape. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. The purple forest stretched in all directions, beautiful and strange in the morning light. The two warriors paused at the tunnel entrance, scanning for threats before allowing Jake to proceed. His crash site was worse than he remembered. The ship had settled further into the mud during the night, tilting at a dangerous angle. The hull was torn open in multiple places, exposing the interior to the elements. Jake felt a moment of despair looking at it. How was he supposed to repair anything in this wreckage? But he had not survived 3 years in deep space by giving up easily. Jake climbed through the torn hull into what remained of the cockpit. The warriors stayed outside, standing guard. They seemed to understand that Jake needed to work, and they positioned themselves to watch the forest for any danger. Jake began his assessment. The main computer was dead. The navigation systems were destroyed. The life support had failed, but the power core buried deep in the ship's center showed green when he checked it. That was good. That meant he had energy to work with. The emergency beacon was designed to survive crashes. It had its own reinforced housing and independent power supply. Jake crawled through the wreckage to reach it. The housing was dented but intact. He carefully opened the access panel and ran diagnostics. The beacon itself was functional. The power cell was charged. But the antenna array was damaged, several connections severed in the crash. Jake pulled out his repair kit and got to work. His hands moved through procedures he had practiced hundreds of times in training. Strip the damaged wires. Check for short circuits. Reconnect following the color codes. Bypass the sections too damaged to repair. It was delicate work made harder by the awkward position and the fact that he was working in a suit with heavy gloves. 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Jake's back ached from being bent over in the cramped space. His fingers hurt from the precise work. But slowly, connection by connection, he rebuilt the beacon's antenna array. Finally, he had done everything he could. Jake activated the beacon and held his breath. The indicator light flickered, turned yellow, then finally green. The beacon was transmitting. His identification codes and his location were being broadcast into space, a signal calling for help. But Jake needed more than just rescue. He needed to send a message, information about what he had found and why it mattered. The ship's main communication array was destroyed, but there was a backup system for emergencies. It had limited range and could only send text, but it was better than nothing. Jake crawled to the backup unit and powered it on. The screen was cracked but still showing display. He had maybe one chance to send a message before the damaged system died completely. He needed to make it count. He began typing, his gloved fingers clumsy on the small keyboard. He described the creatures he had found, their intelligence, their civilization. He described the underground city, the evidence of tool use and language and culture. He detailed the warning carved in their repository, the approaching threat, the timeline. And then Jake made a choice that would likely end his military career. He formally requested immediate military assistance. Not just rescue, but intervention. He was asking his fleet to violate first contact protocols, to insert themselves into a conflict between alien species, to potentially start an interstellar incident. But as he looked out through the broken hull at the two warriors standing guard, as he thought about the cubs playing in the underground city, as he remembered the elder's quiet plea for help, Jake knew it was the right choice. He sent the message. The backup system sparked and died, the screen going dark. But the beacon continued transmitting, its steady pulse sending his location into the void. Now all Jake could do was wait and hope someone would listen. The next 3 days were the longest of Jake's life. He camped near his crash site, using salvaged equipment to create a basic shelter. The warriors stayed with him, hunting in the forest and bringing back food. Jake watched them work and learned. They were efficient hunters, using teamwork and strategy. They communicated with sounds and gestures, coordinating their movements with practiced ease. On the second day, one of the warriors brought Jake a strange fruit. It was testing him, Jake realized, offering food to see if he would accept. Jake took the fruit and ate it carefully. It was sweet and slightly bitter. Not bad, actually. The warrior made a pleased sound. On the third day, Jake heard something that made his heart leap. A high-pitched whine cutting through the air, growing louder. He scrambled out of his shelter and looked up. There, descending through the clouds, was a human dropship. They had received his signal. They had come. The ship landed in a clearing near the crash site. The loading ramp lowered, and Captain Lisa Grant stepped out, followed by a full team of Marines in combat armor. She took one look at Jake standing next to two enormous alien predators, and her hand went to her sidearm. "Stand down!" Jake called out quickly. "They are friendly! They saved my life!" Lisa's eyes narrowed, but she did not draw her weapon. She walked forward slowly, studying the warriors who watched her with equal intensity. "Lieutenant Morrison, your message caused quite a stir. The Admiral wants a full explanation, and it better be good because what you are suggesting could start a war." Jake nodded. "I know, Captain, but I need you to see something first. I need you to meet someone and see their city. Then you can decide if I am crazy or if this is the most important discovery humanity has ever made." Lisa studied Jake's face, then looked at the warriors again. One of them made a low, rumbling sound, not threatening, almost like a greeting. Lisa made a decision. "All right, Lieutenant. Show me what is so important that you are willing to throw away your career for it." Over the next 2 days, Jake led Lisa and her team into the underground city. They brought recording equipment, scientific instruments, and weapons they never had to use. The creatures, whom Jake had started calling the Kalari after the star system, received them cautiously but without hostility. The elder met with Lisa, and though they could not speak directly, meaning passed between them. Lisa examined the carvings in the repository, studied the astronomical warnings, interviewed Jake extensively about everything he had observed. She was a good officer, thorough and fair, and she understood what was at stake. On the evening of the second day, Lisa stood with Jake on a bridge overlooking the underground city. Cubs played below while adults went about their lives, unaware that the fate of their civilization was being decided. "You understand what you are asking," Lisa said quietly. "If we intervene, if we commit military forces to defend this world, we are taking a side in an interstellar conflict. We are declaring ourselves protectors of a species we just met. The political consequences will be enormous." Jake nodded. "I understand, Captain. But I also understand that if we do nothing, all of this disappears. Every one of these people dies. Their culture, their knowledge, their children, everything gone. And we could have stopped it. We could have helped. How do we live with that?" Lisa was quiet for a long time. Then she pulled out her communication unit and opened a channel to her ship. "This is Captain Grant to the horizon. Begin moving the fleet into defensive positions around the planet. Full alert status. And send a message to command. Tell them we have made first contact, and we need reinforcements. We have a civilization to protect." The human fleet moved into position over the next week. 3 warships took up defensive orbits around the planet, while the exploration vessel Horizon served as command and coordination. Scientists and diplomats worked frantically to learn the Kalari language, building communication bridges that would have taken years if they had followed normal protocols. Jake found himself at the center of everything. He was the one the Kalari trusted, the one who had saved their cubs and respected their secrets. He became a translator of sorts, not of words, but of meaning, helping both sides understand each other. The underground cities began to change. Kalari, who had lived their entire lives below ground, started venturing to the surface, guided by human advisors who helped them understand the threat and the defense being prepared. It was strange watching them emerge into daylight, blinking against the brightness, touching trees and grass as if they were precious treasures. The parent creature who had found Jake in the storm stayed close to him. Jake learned that in Kalari culture, this created a bond of obligation and friendship. He had protected their cubs, and now the parent considered Jake part of their family group. The cubs themselves followed Jake everywhere when they could, the smallest one especially attached to him. On the 10th day, the Kalari elder requested a meeting with Jake and Captain Lisa. They gathered in the repository, that place of history and warning. The elder had learned enough human words to communicate basic ideas, and Jake had learned enough Kalari to fill in the gaps. "The enemy ships gather," the elder said, pointing to the astronomical carvings. 3 days, maybe 4, they come here. Lisa nodded grimly. "We see them too. Our sensors confirm it. 23 ships, heavily armed. They are definitely heading this way." The elder looked at Jake with eyes that held both hope and sorrow. "You bring your people to fight for us. Why? You not know us. We not your family." Jake thought about how to answer. Finally, he said, "Because it is right. Because we can help. Because no one should have their home taken from them by force. And because I held your cubs in a storm and I could not walk away. I cannot walk away from any of you." The elder made a sound deep in its chest. Jake had learned this meant deep emotion, approval, connection. The elder reached out and placed a massive paw on Jake's shoulder. "Storm brother," it said, using a Kalari word that meant something like sibling or family through trial. "You are storm brother to the Kalari. This we remember forever." 3 days later, the enemy arrived. The Karathi fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system and began their approach to the planet. They came in formation, weapons armed, shields up. They expected no resistance. This had been their conquest before, and they saw no reason it would be different now. They were wrong. The human warships moved to intercept, and for the first time, the Karathi found themselves facing an opponent they had not planned for. The initial skirmish was brief but decisive. Human weapons technology proved superior in several key areas, and the Karathi ships that engaged first were forced to retreat. But the Karathi had numbers. They regrouped and came at the planet from multiple vectors, trying to force their way through to orbital bombardment range. The battle that followed lit up the space around the planet with weapons fire and exploding ships. On the surface, Jake stood with the Kalari warriors on a hilltop, watching the lights flash in the sky above. The parent creature stood beside him, its cubs safe in the underground city below. The warriors had wanted to fight, but Captain Lisa had convinced them that this battle would be won or lost in space, not on the ground. "Your people fight well," the parent creature said in halting human words. It had been practicing. "So would yours," Jake replied. "If you had ships, this would be your battle." "Someday," the parent creature said. "Someday we build ships again. We learn from humans. We become strong again. But first, we must survive this day." The battle lasted 6 hours. The human fleet fought with skill and determination, using tactics and technology the Karathi had never encountered. But it was not just military might that won the day. It was knowledge. The Kalari had studied their enemies for 200 years, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their strategies. They shared this information with their new human allies, and together they turned the tide. By the time the sun set on that day, the Karathi fleet was in full retreat. 5 of their ships were destroyed, and 8 more were damaged too badly to continue fighting. The remaining vessels jumped away to faster than light, fleeing back to wherever they had come from. The planet was safe, for now. In the days that followed, the real work began. Engineers from the human fleet helped the Kalari begin the process of reclaiming their surface cities. Scientists worked to understand and clean up the environmental damage from the old mining operations. Diplomats established formal relations between humanity and the Kalari people, and Jake Morrison found himself with a new role. He was no longer just a lieutenant in the exploration fleet. He was the first human to make meaningful contact with the Kalari. He was the one who had risked everything to save a civilization. He was, as the Kalari called him, the Storm Brother. The inquiries came, of course. Admirals and politicians wanted to know why Jake had violated protocols, why he had requested military intervention, whether he had acted appropriately. Jake answered every question honestly. Yes, he had broken rules. Yes, he had put his career at risk. Yes, he would do it all again without hesitation. In the end, the evidence spoke for itself. A living, intelligent civilization had been saved. A potential interstellar threat had been neutralized. Humanity had gained an ally and proven itself worthy of trust. The benefits far outweighed the procedural violations. 6 weeks after his crash landing, Jake stood on the surface watching Kalari families emerge from the underground. They came in groups, cautious at first, then with growing confidence. Cubs ran through grass they had never seen before, climbing trees and chasing strange insects. Adults stood in the sunlight, faces turned upward, tears streaming from their eyes. The smallest cub, Jake's favorite, bounded up to him and made happy chirping sounds. It had grown larger in the weeks since the storm, but it still remembered the human who had kept it warm. Jake knelt down and let the cub climb into his lap, its purring vibration making him smile. Captain Lisa approached, datapad in hand. The official word came down from command. You are being promoted to captain. They are also assigning you as the permanent human liaison to the Kalari. Looks like you will be staying here for a while. Jake looked around at the Kalari beginning to rebuild their world, at the cubs playing, at the parent creature watching over them all. I can think of worse assignments, he said. Lisa smiled. The Kalari elder wants to hold a ceremony tonight, something about officially naming you as Stormbrother to their people. You will be written into their histories, Morrison. The human who carried their cubs through a storm and refused to abandon them. Jake thought about that night, the cold and the rain and the fear. He thought about the choice he had made to save 3 small lives. It had seemed like such a simple decision at the time. Help creatures in need. But that choice had cascaded into something so much larger. It had changed the fate of 2 civilizations. It was just the right thing to do, Jake said quietly. That is what makes it meaningful, Lisa replied. You had every excuse not to help. You were stranded, in danger, facing the unknown. But you helped anyway. That is who humans are at our best. That is the legacy you have created here. That night, under the stars that the Kalari had not seen in 200 years, the ceremony was held. Hundreds of Kalari gathered in a clearing that had once been the center of their capital city. Humans stood among them, no longer strangers, but allies and friends. The elder spoke in the Kalari language, which was now being translated by the computers that human engineers had provided. It told the story of the Storm Brother, the human who had crashed on their world and found 3 cubs in need. It spoke of courage and compassion, of choices made in darkness that brought light to many. The parent creature came forward with its 3 cubs, now nearly half-grown. It spoke of the debt owed, the bond created, the family expanded. Then the smallest cub approached Jake, carrying something in its mouth. A carved stone, shaped and polished, with symbols that Jake now recognized as his name in Kalari writing. Jake accepted the gift, feeling its weight in his hands. This was more than just a token. This was a piece of history, a promise that his actions would be remembered for generations. He would be in the stories they told their children, the human who had refused to walk away. As the ceremony concluded and the Kalari began to celebrate their reclaimed world, Jake looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Karathi were regrouping, planning their next move. This was not the end of the threat, just a battle won. There would be more challenges ahead, more dangers to face. But for tonight, there was joy. There were cubs playing under the stars. There were families reunited with the surface world they had been forced to abandon. There was hope, real and tangible, growing in the space between two species who had learned to trust each other. Jake Morrison had set out to explore the galaxy. He had crashed in a storm, made a simple choice to help creatures in need, and in doing so had become a bridge between worlds. Some people spent their entire lives searching for meaning and purpose. Jake had found his in the eyes of 3 frightened cubs on a stormy night. And that, he thought as he watched the celebrations around him, was more than enough. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders. But sometimes the most important moments happened in the smallest acts of kindness. Sometimes saving the world started with saving just 3 small lives in a storm. Jake held the carved stone close and smiled. Storm Brother. It was a good name, and it was a responsibility he would carry proudly for the rest of his days.